everybody, and welcome to the first Bloomsday online Bloomsday talk hosted by the Embassy of Ireland. With us today are Kola Tubosun and from Lagos and Dr. Adrian Peterson calling in from Galway. I'd like to welcome you all, and just to start us off, we're going to play a message from our hosts, the Embassy of Ireland. Off we go.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to today's most interesting Bloomsday discussion. You're very welcome. My name is Ronan Mullen, and I'm the Deputy Head of Mission at the Irish Embassy in Nigeria. And the Embassy is delighted to have been able to support and facilitate today's event, which I think will shine a new light on the literary links between Ireland and Nigeria. I have to say I'm really delighted to have a former lecturer of mine from NUIG, Dr. Adrian Patterson, here with us today. Some of my happiest memories of university was studying Joyce and realising he's not as inaccessible as I once thought. In fact, once you break into the world of Joyce, he really is the gift that keeps on giving. And every year, Bloomsday, June 16th, spurs us to think about Joyce in new ways. And I think being here in Nigeria, what a better way to look at Joyce than to look at how a great Nigerian writer and Nobel laureate, Nwoyinka, has engaged with Joyce in his own work. And I think the poem being discussed today, Ulysses, Notes from Here to My Joyce Class, is a really liberating poem. I think at a time when we're all pretty isolated, it's a great time to listen to something like this, and it's just incredible that he wrote this poem while imprisoned. It really does show how strong the human imagination can be, and I think when you hear Kola Tubosun's rendition of it, you can almost feel the sea air. It's the perfect poem for a time like this. And look, I'm sure you're all going to really enjoy today's discussion. We've got a really great panel with Aduke Gomez, Kola Tubosun, and Dr. Adrian Patterson. And I know there's going to be some good questions from the audience as well today. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to announce the launch of the Embassy of Ireland's Bloomsday writing competition. So the guidelines are very simple. Write a poem of no more than 40 lines on the theme of isolation. Entrants must be based in Nigeria. And the deadline for submissions is the 16th of July, and the winner will be announced on July 26th. The winner will receive a cash prize of 50,000 naira, and their poem will be published in the online publication Brittle Paper. Keep a close eye on our Twitter for more information, and you'll see it being publicised on other websites as well. So I won't keep you any longer, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the wonderful experience that Aduke, Kola, Adrian have in store for us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to take a moment quickly to introduce the panelists to the audience. Kola is a linguist. He's also a writer. He's also a travel journalist. At the moment, he's a Chevening Fellow at the British Library, and he's also writing a biography on Wole Soyinka. So he was an apt choice for today. Dr. Adrian Patterson is a lecturer at the National University of Ireland in Galway. He is head of department of the first year English students. He has lectured extensively on Irish literature, Yeats, Joyce, and the whole plethora. So we're going to get stuck in here. I'm going to ask, first of all, because today is unique. Not only is it Bloomsday, which I'm going to ask Adrian to tell us a bit more about, but Bloomsday was inspired by the novel Ulysses, which was written by James Joyce. This in turn inspired a poem of Shoinka's, which Kola is going to play a recording of now so that we can just be in the mindset and understand the direction this conversation is going to go in.
Ulysses, Notes from Here to My Joyce Class by Wole Soyinka. Hunting the music of the mind, I watched once, through sun slats, a raindrop lengthening out to rivers on a window pane. And on this penless rack of time, stretched I was, heritage of thought, clay and voices, passing easily to wind and rain becoming. And, lest I lose the landmarks of my being, pocked the air with terse, echoing rounds, drum-tap fillers on the growth of leaves. This storm has cold wings, and they beat and interchange in time to death and birth. The rain's harrowing passion, midwife love, winds, newcomer wanderer, and toils lodged in barrenness of anterooms to manger heaven. I, sleepwalker, through the weary cycle of the season's womb, laboring to give birth to a deathless self. One more reveler at the rites, I watch the years relay their yeasting dregs beneath the froth, hard souls travel pressed in poultice of new loam. We embrace the world and I in great infinitudes. I grow into that portion of the world, lapping my feet, yet bear the rain of nails that drill within to that archetypal heart of all lone wanderers. How pleasant to have toyed with concepts, time, we have touched upon it. Time I hold beyond my hands, a febrile heart, slowing to the calm of death. It weighs all and nothing, seized with rain and ran between my fingers. It was a crystal cover on the world. A rake of thunders showered its fragments to a slow dissolve in hailstones. And I was held a while to its truthfulness and transience, but not for long. It flowed to raise a flotsam from tobacco shreds, weaving space inflated to a swell of dancing seas and pygmy fountains. Detritus of change, words on continuity, drowned steeples of the broken seas, tossed thorn in matrices, mud consummation. I trail a seaweed cord to hold your breaths to mine, prime turd among a sea of feces. Oh, how we surf wrestle to manure the land at ebb. How golden finally is the recovered fleece? A question we refuse to ask the bard. It turns on quest cycles to track a skein of self through eyeless veils, stumble on warps, endure the blinds of spidery distortions till swine-scented folds and caressing tunnels come to crossroads at the straits between virginal rocks. Here, the moments of times overlap, forfeiture of flesh. We shed our questions here, turn from scratching upon the calloused skin of blind redemptive doors, on minds grown hoary from the quest's rests, rooted even in the turmoil agency, a bolder solitude amidst wine-scented waves, and hold, in paradox of lighthouse windows on dark falling seas, our lighted beings, suspended as mirages on the world's reality.
Wow, that's a poem that's so beautiful, so deep, and each time I've been reading it, you just see more and more images. So that, and I think it's a shame it's not more well known. And I think it's an incredible poem to think that it could have been written under the conditions under which it was written, because it was written while he was in prison. But before we go into that, I'm going to ask Adrian to tell us a bit more about Bloomsday, to set in context for us what is Bloomsday and how does Joyce relate to today's audience. Is he still relevant? Is it, or is he, I mean, the book was published in 1922. Is it something that does it have something that we still should be learning from? Your mic is off. You need to unmute yourself. Okay, off you go.
Okay, thank you, Aduke. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Thank you, Ronan, for asking me, and thank you all for coming from so far away to listen. As Aduke says, I think Joyce does have relevance today, partly because of this fact that we are listening from far away, and some of the things I'm going to talk about are about different ways that literature can help us listen and overhear the thoughts of others. I'm speaking from Galway in Ireland, where Joyce's wife, Nora Barnacle, was born, and where on a visit here 111 years ago, James Joyce listened to Nora's mother, singing for him a song called The Lass of Aughrim, which ends up in his short story, The Dead. And we can kind of imagine them sitting there together at the kitchen table in a way that we can't do today. That reminds, I think, that songs and singers really need an audience, preferably a live audience, but poetry and poets, not so much. John Stuart Mill draws a distinction between eloquence and poetry. Eloquence, he says, and I think it's true of song as well, is heard, but poetry is overheard. Poetry is feeling, confessing itself to itself in moments of solitude. So one of the things I wanted to do today was talk about poetry, because it seems that poets are the kind of the prophets of solitude, of isolation. So though I'll also be talking about the novel Ulysses and how it connects to us, I'm going to start with a poem that I think also can help with. It's one of Joyce's own poems. Joyce himself wanted to be a singer. He had a good tenor voice by all accounts, but professionally speaking, he was a poet, and it's how he starts writing, actually. His first book of poems, his first book of any kind is poetry. And when I thought that he'd written this poem called Alone in his second book of poems, I thought, well, that's going to say something interesting. And it does, but not quite in the way I expected. So I'm going to try an experiment and share my screen. Hang on a minute here so that we can all see it together. I hope this is going to work. Let's see. Yeah, I think that will work. And if not, it doesn't matter because I'll read it out. Yeah. Is that visible? Is that visible?
Yes,
yeah.
It is.
Okay. It's poem number 10 of a really tiny little book of poems called Poems Penny Each. 12 poems with one extra. It's kind of a baker's dozen. And no one really talks about it very much. It's not very noticed kind of poem, but it's small and perfectly formed. Reading it on the page is helpful, but I thought I'd read it out loud because really to attend to its sound patterns, you have to hear it. Alone. The moon's grey golden meshes make all night a veil. The shore lamps in the sleeping lake, laburnum tendrils trail. The sly reeds whisper to the night, a name, her name, and all my soul is a delight, a swoon of shame. So the situation of the speaker, he's come out into nighttime, into the privacy of night, is standing alone on the edge of a lake. He's looking across the water at the moon and the reflected lamplight, which kind of contrives to wrap him in meshes, in veils, in trailing tendrils, which light doesn't really do. And if he's wrapped up in anything, it seems to be wrapped up in sound and sound patterns. And we can hear the poem mating its own patterns in which we get a mesh too. There's the L sounds in the first stanza, the veil, the tendrils trail, the S sounds of the second stanza, sly reeds whisper, or the kind of intimacy of those N and M mouth murmurs throughout moon and laburnum and name and name. It's actually kind of intricately plotted. It's hard to imagine how you could change a word of it. You'd have to change the whole thing to do that. But it takes pleasure in its sound, which in the same way seems to me echo the way the speaker takes a pleasure in recalling the sound of his beloved's name. It gives him almost a kind of sexual frisson. We don't find out anything about this person, anything about them, whether it's his wife or lover. We don't even find out the name that he's whispering or hearing the reeds whisper. There's nothing. It's a secretive poem, in other words, Alone. It's about a private, pleasurable experience cut off from us. The speaker is alone, but he's having too much fun to be really isolated. So it seems to me the poem's alone, but it's not really about isolation. which is maybe why no one much remembers it. There's no way, it doesn't really reach out and resonate with our own experience in some way. It's no interest in us at all. It chooses to be alone. Which brings us back to partly why we're all here today. I mean, Joyce is a writer well known around the world. He was also claimed to be alone. He went out of Ireland and went into exile in Italy and in Switzerland and France. But he claimed sometimes that he was kind of run out of Ireland by a literary establishment, but that's not really true. They all tried to help him. His choice was to be alone as a writer. And I think that was kind of helpful to him. It was kind of a pose that was helpful in the way he was thinking about writing. And oddly enough, for someone that was trying to be so alone, his book has brought us all back together today. When he wrote the poem in 1916, he was in Zurich working on his book Ulysses. And he wasn't really alone at all. He had his family with him. He had lots of people to talk to, one of whom was an Englishman called Frank Budgeon, who wrote a good book about this, actually, called James Joyce and the Making of Ulysses. And Budgeon was a painter who, as an artist, kind of empathizes with Joyce's desire to be alone. And particularly the character which he embodies his desires, a character called Stephen Dedalus, who's an artist who we've met previously if we've read A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, where he kind of, I don't know, he poses like a secret agent of literature. He thinks he's kind of the James Bond of literature or something, who at the end of his book is to leave on some secret artistic mission. And Ulysses is kind of the sequel to this, where Stephen actually, his mission has failed and he's kind of returned with his tail between his legs. But anyway, Budgeon reads the opening chapters of Ulysses, particularly the third episode, Proteus, where Stephen goes for a walk on the Sandy Mount shore. And it's something I think that Soyinka also read, because it's something he refers to repeatedly, I think, in his poems. Says Budgeon, he's free, alone, essentially himself, with a vast, bright space around him. And it's an important moment in the book. Stephen is taking pleasure in being alone. He resolves also to return, not to return that night to the Martello Tower where he's been staying, and not even to meet his friends in the pub. So he's kind of turning in on himself. He's kind of self-consciously alone, I think, and takes pleasure in his inventive mind. He jots down phrases that he thought to use in his poems. He thinks about time and space and how we perceive them. And even as a kind of philosophical experiment, he closes his eyes while he's walking along the shore to listen to the sounds, to hear what he can still perceive while he's doing that. And he sort of plays with ideas in his mind, which leaves us, I think, kind of some way apart from the things he's observing. All the things he sees on the seashore, the kind of flotsam, the detritus in the mud. There's a live dog running around who's sniffing a dead dog and various things like that. He's islanded. He's literally isolated. I mean, isola, the Latin word, means island. So he's kind of literally on the edge of things in some way, between the sea and the land, on the edge of consciousness. Which is exactly the situation, it seems to me, of Soyinka's poem. This is the second part of Soyinka's poem, which is also set in a seashore world of change and flux and drift of the mind. And some of those words, flotsam and detritus and mud and seaweed and those kind of words, actually I think he gets from, they appear also in Joyce's book in this particular episode. Even the line, how pleasant to have toyed with concepts, is, you know, is something that exactly is what Stephen's doing at this moment. And I think there's a level of irony in the way Soyinka uses the line. To have toyed with concepts is something important, possibly, but also it's not the only thing the mind should do or can do. Not all of us are always in this situation, self-isolated like an artist who can enjoy the play of their own mind. Many of us are right now kind of alone, and not necessarily by artistic choice. We're just alone, and our situation is mundane, maybe more prosaic. We're isolated in a kind of uncomfortably real world. But thankfully, the poem suggests that there's more to the experience of isolation than just playing and toying with concepts, and so does the book Ulysses, I think. And this is where the book reminds us really that we're not alone, and I think this is where it can help us on times like now. Stephen in the book is not alone. There are other people and other perspectives than that of a young man who thinks he's a kind of failed secret agent. or thinks he's Hamlet, or thinks he's all sorts of things, people who are alone. And fittingly for Bloomsday, we have to come to the Blooms. Mrs. Marion, or Molly Bloom, who has a kind of unpunctuated river of consciousness that closes the book, and Mr. Leopold, or Poldy Bloom, who's the central character, the center of gravity in the novel. He's kind of an everyday hero. He's a prosaic version of the Greek hero Odysseus, who the Romans called it Ulysses. So he's sort of whom the book is named after in a way. If Stephen is poetry because he writes and thinks about poetry, Bloom is definitely prose. But also if Stephen is the lyric and the dramatic, Bloom is kind of epic too. Because what we get in the novel is not just a portrait of an artist, but the representation of a whole man, a whole person. Budgeon, who was a painter, said that the depiction of Bloom was more like sculpture, actually. He was a figure you could kind of walk all the way around, meaning he's not just like a face, he's a bum as well. He's everything. And we actually do follow him as he goes to the toilets. And you note that Soyinka's poem actually includes kind of feces and mud and those kind of things too. So we see Bloom all the way around, and we also see him from without and within at the same time. We see him as others see him and as he sees himself. And we know more about him by the end of the day, says Budgeon, than any other character in fiction. So I thought I'd think about the questions, what do we find about him, and how does this happen, and why does that matter to us now? Well, according to Budgeon, Bloom is always the same kindly, prudent, level-tempered, submissive, tragically isolated, shrewd, skeptical, simple, uncensorious person with an outward seemingly soft and pliant, but with an inner core of self-sufficiency. So Budgeon says he's tragically isolated, even while he's among so many people, because he's lives in a busy city full of hundreds of thousands of people, a city populated by individuals, some of whom we've met before in Joyce's previous books, and there are at least kind of 200 named individuals in the poem. Is this working, by the way? Can anyone hear me? Hope you'll chat. Okay, we're okay. Okay. Anyway, so Bloom's job involves going out and meeting all these people. So you wouldn't think he'd be isolated. He's an advertisement canvasser. He's an agent for arranging space in newspapers. And to do that, he has to kind of go around the city and meet people. He's not quite as much as Stephen is a lone wanderer, which is a phrase, again, from
Somebody has asked and they've answered. Yes, we can hear.
Oh, yeah, good. Yeah, we can hear. Good. He's actually kind of self-conscious about talking to people. He imagines conversations in his head that don't quite go as he planned. He's likable, but not really liked. And because of his job, people think he's kind of always out for something. He's tight with money. And what's worse, from the perspective of a kind of anti-Semitic Dublin of 1904, he's Jewish. So he's an unorthodox Jew, there's no question, but he's somehow, I think, therefore, although he's not literally in exile, he's ostracized. He's an outsider in the city he calls home. And when we meet him, he's alone. He's making breakfast with no one else there. His son has died long before. His daughter is working in the country. His wife is still in bed. And we learn his only companion is a cat. We learn actually that his wife is going to have an affair later that day. So he seems isolated when we start meeting him, but he's somehow self-sufficient. He's practical. He gets on with things. And he's at home with his own body. And we know all this because we get so close to him. We see him in the toilet and in the bath and all those intimate places, but most of all, we overhear him thinking. He seems unaware of any listener, but the reader's intimacy is just kind of assumed by the novel. We just turn up and start overhearing what he thinks. And this, I think, is similar to the trick of what poetry does sometimes, that Ezra Pound calls these parts of the book interior poetry. And I think they assume the kind of intimacy of poetry that just starts going and we have to follow and listen. I mean, some parts of this are so candid that they couldn't be printed when the novel was first published in the Little Review. But we know they matter to Joyce because when he published them in book form, he actually expanded these sections enormously. And so we can eavesdrop, we can overhear Bloom's thought patterns, what Soyinka in his poem calls the music of the mind. So we see him seeing things. And I've got just one example of him doing this, because I've no time for more, I think. It seems to me that we watch Bloom noticing things, and in that he's a real poet. He observes, he reads, he hums, he even sings to himself, and we can hear what the songs that he sings in his head. He writes, not very well, but he does write, and he imagines little stories. And here is an example of him actually kind of showing empathy and compassion for people. He shows compassion for animals, even inanimate objects. But this example is from episode 6 of the novel, where Bloom is with some companions on the way to a funeral in a horse and carriage. When it stops, the carriage halted short. And Bloom, being helpful, put his head out the window and says, "Oh, we're next to the Grand Canal," and sees something very unpromising to think about, which is a gasworks just by the side of the road. But instead of thinking about its ugliness, as Stephen might do, or about how isolated he is really from his companions, it leads to a reverie about illness and infectious diseases, which seems, still relevant today. Gasworks, he says. Whooping cough, they say it cures. Good job, Millie never got it. Poor children. Doubles them up, black and blue in convulsions. Shame, really. Got off lightly with illness compared. Only measles, flaxseed tea, scarlatina, influenza epidemics, canvassing for death. Don't miss this chance. And we overhear him kind of thinking about scarlet fever, about almost kind of foreseeing the Spanish influenza epidemics that come around this time when Joyce was finishing the episode in 1918. He thinks about the infant mortality and the kind of bad cures, the flaxseed tea, and even being next to a gasworks that might cure things. And he starts thinking about it. Becomes a kind of mordant reflection on death and on his own profession. I mean, he imagines, as an advertising agent, he recognizes in the spread of the illness something familiar. The power of words, the power of marketing, as we would say, something that would go viral, and darkly compose a kind of advertising slogan on behalf of death. Don't miss this chance. This once in a lifetime chance to die is something that he imagines death advertising. And that could be quite gloomy, but then funny, we kind of pull out from that. A raindrop spat on his hat. He drew back and saw an instant of shower spray, dots over the grey flags apart. Curious, like through a colander. I thought it would. My boots were creaking, I remember now. And instead we kind of come out from his thoughts. This word curious I've highlighted because it's his curiosity about the world that can teach us something. I mean, his thought process is rather different from Soyinka's and rather different from Stephen's, I think, but it's still interested in rain and raindrops. I mean, Soyinka's poem opens with a kind of raindrop, but Bloom thinks about the way the world works and perception and things too, the sights and sounds, the touch of water, of moisture, even the sound of his footsteps as his boots creaking while he walks, which kind of recalls Stephen's experiments on the Strand, as he walks, kind of squelches through the Strand. So Bloom is a figure that can teach us something, I think. He can teach us how to take pleasure in small things. He can teach us how to wait for things. He's always waits for things to happen. He's not really someone that does something. In that he's unlike Odysseus. He's a kind of a passive figure maybe, but then also he's got a kind of almost Christ-like example of accepting the world as it is, and love for those in it. So he's overhearing Bloom so intimately on the page is, I think, a lesson for us all. And when he returns home, he does more than murmur his lover's name. He kisses his wife's bottom, the melons of her rump. And like Odysseus, he starts to tell a story. It's a long story because it's the story of his day, and so rather unheroically he falls asleep. But the book isn't done, and then we get Molly, who's been listening to Bloom, who's heard more than he thinks. She has the last word, and in turn, the reader overhears what she makes of listening to him, and the story is again kind of transformed. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say, it's a book about listening, about overhearing, sometimes mishearing, observing people listening. But by doing something like this, where we can overhear people's thoughts, Joyce manages something new. He takes the intimacy of poetry into prose, into the space between something that we've heard and something that's overheard, between word and thought, between sea and the land. He shows us how things connect and how we all connect, that no one and nothing is entirely isolated. And that's something to which Soyinka's poem, I think, responds, and many of us today can try to respond to. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Thank you. That's a very insightful and a full lecture on Joyce in just a few minutes. I'm going to ask that you please stop sharing your screen.
I'm going to try. Just give me a second.
Okay.
I'll do it.
Okay. And
Okay.
while Adrian is doing that, I'm going to turn to Kola. Kola, you're there?
Yes, I am.
Okay. Now, what I think is interesting about Ulysses is that it was published in 1922. So it was written at a time when Ireland itself was going through a period of nationalism and trying to reinvent itself as an independent country. Ireland got its independence in 1921. So I think it's apt that Soyinka's poem was written when he was in prison during a time that Nigeria itself was struggling with the nationalism question. Now, what were your views on this poem, and do you think this poem has anything to say to us today?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and thank you, Adrian, for that wonderful lecture. One of the things I found, I mean, it's more than even just the story of Ireland and nationalism and all of that. You know that the poem itself was taken out of a collection of 4 poems called The 4 Archetypes. And the others were Joseph, Hamlet, and Gulliver. And in each of those poems, the writer tries to imagine himself as, you know, this fable heroic character in classical literature. Joseph, of course, we know what happened with Potiphar. He was in prison for rejecting the advances of riches and power. And there was Hamlet, who was in prison in his mind and trying to make, you know, decisions. And there was Gulliver, who was also in an island with people he deemed, you know, lower than him metaphorically and physically. And there was Ulysses. When Adrian mentioned, you know, Stephen, you know, also thinking of himself as Hamlet, I noticed that kind of similarity as well, which is Soyinka interrogating classical literature and using his own story as a way of, you know, interpreting what was going on with him at the time. So when he wrote this, he was in prison, like I said. I mean, the book was published in 1972. Joyce's own was published in 1922, which is 50 years apart. And still, he was able to take himself back and try to use the moment of isolation to connect himself both to the physicality of his imprisonment, as well as his kind of being at odds with society, which is something Joyce has been obsessed with himself. The idea that you're in a society and you're still lonely in that way, where, you know, you're walking around this one big city in one day and experiencing different things and still being alone. So I found that very interesting. When I was reading and studying and preparing for this, I found a lot of other similarities in Soyinka's work with Joyce. The influences are actually, you know, way bigger than has been, you know, written about. Of course, many people have mentioned them as well. The Interpreters, a book that was published in 65, it's a novel, Soyinka's first novel, also tries to interrogate this kind of idea of, you know, these people who are at odds with the society living. It's a story of 5 different middle-class people who had returned from abroad, from the UK, and were dealing with a society where everything around them seems at odds with their own kind of dilemma in trying to figure out who they were and what kind of things they did. So I think for a long time he has been interrogating this idea, and it goes through many of Soyinka's work, and it takes a lot of inspiration from what Joyce did. And I found a lot of other similarities as well. This influence of modernism. I mean, Joyce was like the father of, I mean, his work was kind of a defining moment in modernism of, you know, using literature not just as a way of telling a story, but also as challenging the form itself and the way you write it. And many people who you ask about Shoyinka will tell you about how it's inaccessible, how they can't reach him and it's hard to read. And I found out it's the same thing people say with Joyce. People spend months reading Ulysses trying to figure out every aspect of what it's been about. And Shoyinka seems to be that kind of person as well in Nigerian literature, where you read one poem and you're like, okay, what is it? What's going on here? And then when you finally get close to it and see where all his influences come, you find that it's actually not a very hard poem to read after all. And I find that in his prose, I find that in his poetry as well. And then both of them lived in Paris, of course. I think Joyce eventually moved to Trieste with his wife and stuff like that. And if you've read this book, Ibadan Dipenkelemezi, yes, it's Shoyinka's third book of prose. It's kind of autobiographical novel. He tries to remove himself from the character, whom he called Maren, but who was actually himself as a young man. It was a story of him returning to Nigeria in 1960 and eventually taking over the radio station in the Southwest. It reminds me of Stephen Dedalus, which is also, as many people have said, an extension of Joyce himself. Somebody you create as a fictional character, but embodies much of the things you yourself are dealing with at the time. And there is the issue of British imperialism, which affected Ireland, as we know, as much as it did Nigeria, as Aduke was mentioning. I found it interesting that how both of them, co-opted language to their own advantage, a language that has been used at some point to oppress them, and then bend it and expand it, with poetry and prose in their own different ways. And that's that. And then, of course, both of them shone classical religious influences. Shoyinka was raised as a Protestant son of a pastor, and Joyce, of course, as a Catholic, he has Catholic influences, many of which he rejected eventually. So in the poem Ulysses, I found just the classical allusions very interesting. Not all of them are clear from the start, like I said, but it's a poem that is musical, and you hear it, you really feel, the intensity, the urgency of the time, even though the person is standing in one place contemplating different things from afar. People who have read Joyce would find the influences like you did, thankfully. I found that, I was reading Alfred Lord Tennyson's Ulysses, a poem of the same name, just yesterday. And I was, to find the total difference in the way both of them approached the same subject. Tennyson was, imagining himself as, somebody that was just Ulysses in his old age, contemplating life and how it's been. Whereas Shoyinka's is this one person in isolation and all of that. So Shoyinka, of course, more closer to what Joyce did. And Joyce, didn't follow, even though the book was called Ulysses, didn't follow what Tennyson did at all. Even Tennyson was 1882 or thereabout. So, so it's interesting, of course, that Tennyson's poem is more famous, of course, because he was talking about the same old thing. But Shoyinka's, looking at it from a point of view of one individual contemplating life and using the same allusions from old classical literature, I found very, very interesting. One more thing, when I read The Man Died, which is another story, prose work written around the same time when this collection of poetry was written, there were other classical references there as well. I remember Shoyinka referring to one of the jailers as Polyphemus, which is one character with one eye in old classical story. But apparently there was another reference there that I discovered just recently. Joyce had said Ireland is the old sow that eats its farrow. He said that in the Portrait of Artist as a young man, trying to talk about this country as, eating its own. There was a character in The Man Died as well, which Shoyinka named Sow. And, there was Polyphemus, there was Sow, he used all of them as references to talk about his own feeling about his country and the people managing it and managing the security apparatus. So these are many connections I found while reading that, and I think it's very interesting. So people who approach Shoyinka, as being difficult, should talk to people who have tried to read James Joyce Ulysses, I think, and they will find that modernism is modernism. Writers taking liberty and trying to create new forms out of old ones would always end up creating these huge gifts of literature to us, and it's up to us to find as many different links as have been packed in them as possible. Thank you.
That was interesting. I have a couple of questions to both of you. Um, Ulysses was the original Ulysses was a hero of the War of Troy, but he's also remembered for his 10-year journey back home. And if we look at that 10-year journey back home as a form of exile, isn't it interesting that both Shoyinka and Joyce were on exile, and both of them on self-exile for various reasons? And so the question I want to ask you both is that, do you think that as an artist, sometimes you have to be in self-exile to look into the society you want to comment about? Is it difficult to breathe and be artistic in the society you want to talk about, or must you be at a step removed? Adrian, I'll ask you to go first.
I think that's a good question. I think it's a question that Joyce is kind of continually asking himself, and explores throughout. It takes several books to bother exploring that question. I mean, Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist as a young man, in a sense, is preparing himself for exactly the kind of isolation you're talking about, where you have to be apart from the society in which you live. You have to be apart from your family, apart from even your religion, from your nation, in order to really think about it. And in some ways, that's a very kind of noble idea. But in some ways, I think what you realize if you look at Stephen in Ulysses is that not only has Stephen come back in the beginning of the book, we learn that Stephen is back in Ireland, sort of literally speaking, but also the whole book of Ulysses is still about Ireland. It doesn't really escape nationality. It doesn't really escape religion. And that escaping those things is finally impossible, that you have to involve yourself in those things. And I think in a kind of more personal sense, that's why Stephen is paired by Bloom. Stephen still has the idea that one should really be isolated to write poetry. And there are a lot of poems of isolation, a tradition in which he's drawing and in which Shoyinka is drawing as well, I think, but which you could come back to. But I think one of the reasons to have Bloom there is the reminder that we're all interconnected in some ways. And the story of the book is that the two of them meeting, maybe partially unsuccessfully, but they nonetheless meet and sort of exchange intimacies about music and about other things. So I don't know the answer to your question, but I think it's one that Joyce is clearly asking himself over and over again. And I wonder if that's true for Shoyinka as well. That in some of his poem, he seems to want to be isolated, but clearly it's not an isolation by choice. So there's a difficulty with that, and you need a different perspective too. You need an older and a younger perspective. Anyway, that's. What does Collar think? Collar's talk was fantastic, so
Yes.
I want to.
Yes, I was writing something now. I know Shoyinka typically, he often says he's a closet glutton for tranquility, which is to say that in spite of all you know about him as a public figure who likes to involve himself in a number of political things, he still likes his private moments to be able to write. I remember that The Man Died, the book, and this poem, which was written about the same time, is in prison. The first draft were actually written when he left Nigeria in the 70s after the war ended and he was released from prison. So I do understand the allure of being removed from a space that has given you so much to think about, to be able to write about it. Even my collection of poetry was written 3 years after I had left the space where the main ideas in there were formed. So, I mean, for writers, generally, solitude is a thing that is valuable. I don't know whether it's always necessary. It doesn't mean that if you can't leave, that you can't write about it. Even in prison, your mind can still escape your present moments to be able to capture what it is you want to write about. But there is always a need to find a space, whether physically or mentally, where you can embody the moments to put down the thoughts and ideas and passions you have about particular issues.
And of course, that last comment that you made is something that Adrian referred to. Talk about Hamlet and how if you stay too much in your head, you actually perhaps will not implement the work you're supposed to do, or you will not implement it at the time that you should. Do you think that Joyce or Shoyinka had a sense of, I must do this now? Is there a sense of urgency in their work, or are they Hamlets because in Ulysses, where Stephen talks about Hamlet, it's not the conventional sense we have of him. So do you think that both of them are driven by Hamlet as the anti-hero as compared to Odysseus, who is the action hero?
That's a good question. I certainly it's a distinction that someone like Yeats would draw between the kind of sedentary artist and the kind of active person. And it's always something that he found difficult to reconcile, whether you should do things or whether you should stop and write things. I think when it comes to Hamlet, Stephen in the book thinks he's in Hamlet. He thinks he's soliloquizing. He's wearing black. You know, he's, as you say, he's really not doing something. He's wandering around, choosing not to do something. And so Stephen gets a lot from that. And maybe we don't know how much Stephen learns throughout the book, in a sense, but we can imagine that he might learn that the process of art is partly about in the making of art. It's not in the kind of final product. It's not actually in the actual finished doing of the thing. I mean, Joyce kind of has the book turned back on itself. It's really a book about the making of art. So Stephen's poetry, we don't really see much of. We see little bits of his poetry as we do in Portrait of an Artist, a Young Man. But the point is not the finished poem. I think the idea is that Stephen, or at least we are to understand, the point is in what goes into the making of that poem. So in some way, I think that can still a reflective thing, but it's not, but I mean, to put it simply, to answer your question, there isn't a choice between thinking and doing. Thinking in that sense can be doing, right? That thinking can be the doing that you're actually involved in. And so that the action, the final product isn't the thing that matters. And I think maybe that's what we might be supposed to learn, or Stephen learns from Bloom and Ulysses.
In Schwenker's case,
what are your thoughts?
In Schwenker's case, it's usually a combination of both. For instance, thinking about even the decision to decide that this work you created in prison has to be two different work, The Man Died and Poems from Prison. They're from the same experience. And even if you read The Man Died, you'll find excerpts of some of those poems already there. Just the idea that putting them separately as two different work is a kind of conscious decision, as this book, The Man Died, is my personal intervention in the Nigerian situation and a record of it. And the poem is just a reflection on what was going on in my mind at the same time. And of course, looking at Shoyinka's life himself, you know that he has never shied away from actually being directly involved in the stuff. So in some way, you know, he reminds us of Ulysses himself, you know, and, you know, the wars, the battles, the exile and all of that, as well as the Bloom, I mean, the Stephen, who's mostly in his head thinking about all these things he wants to do, all the things he has done. So in Shoyinka's case, I would say is a little bit of both, and his life and his work testify to this.
I have a question actually to you, Carla. Was that all right? Okay.
Please.
My question.
Please, I was actually going to say that I'm going to open up to questions, but before I do, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you both to have first dibs at it. So please ask yourself questions first.
Okay. Well, my question to Carla is, I'm really interested by the fact that there's so many works of literature in the poem Ulysses, as of course there is in the book Ulysses. And you mentioned Tennyson's Ulysses, which is actually presents Ulysses or Odysseus as an old man, a hoary figure, drinking, hoping his drunk life to the lees, and then hopes to go out on one more voyage, which is kind of interesting. It's got an old man, young man thing going on, I think, in that poem. It's one of the gaps the poem presents between here, presumably now, and my Joyce class when I was younger. I think there's that going on. But but I wonder why you think he's drawing on so many different kind of literary things, whether it's Odysseus or Tennyson's Ulysses or Joyce, or any other number of prison poems. I mean, because some people would say that that's elitist, you know, to populate your mind with other literature is kind of elitist and apart from the world. And I was wondering the same about Joyce, I suppose, whether, you know, is that really true, or is that just a way of actually populating the mind with other books and ideas that actually can help people kind of bring you in, you know what I mean? That actually talking about Odysseus is a concept that we can all understand. I don't know.
Yeah. First of all, I mean, we have to acknowledge that being in prison, you know, we all don't have the same experience of what it's like to be in isolation. I think it was for 18 months or so in, you know, isolation. So we don't know how that influences the idea that most of the things he's learned and read come back to haunt him or to present opportunities for him to express himself. So there is that. There's the other one about modernism, like I mentioned earlier, which is just the writer's decision to write in a different way, to challenge conventions. And many of the criticisms of Soyinka's works have come from that angle of him writing for other writers. You know, the same criticism for Kibo, which is that, you know, you're writing a level that doesn't carry along everyone else who, you know, might just be able to just take a piece of poem and get through it. So, you know, there's that. And then Soyinka's background himself, he read English literature, Greek, and history in the University of Ibadan. So there is a lot of classical background that he has that I think come to bear on all of this. So I assume that it's a combination of all of those things. The mind in prison, his own background, or his own decision to decide, you know, what kind of ways express himself. And of course, also, it's a collection of poems about, you know, being in prison. And like I said, The Man Died was already the record of the direct action. And this was a kind of more esoteric reflection on the same ideas. And he, you know, he talks about himself being Joseph, being Hamlet, being Gulliver. I think it was deliberate in trying to say that, you know, I want to take you along this journey with, you know, through classical heroes, maybe as a way of educating new readers, you know, as to these particular characters, as well as his own, you know, kind of conflicting his own personal circumstance with those of those great heroes and archetypes.
Mm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it seems to me it's not necessarily elitist. It can partly teach us how to read things. You know, it teaches us.
Yeah.
I mean, teaching is too strong a word. It might sound patronizing, but I think that's right. That you read a poem, if you allow yourself to, you read a poem like Ulysses, Notes from Here to My Joyce class, and your mind starts moving in different ways than it was doing before. And I think that might be partly the kind of thing that's interesting.
And if he hadn't written Notes to My Joyce class, it would have made it harder for people to understand where the influences were coming from, unless you were somebody who were already familiar with, you know, what Joyce was writing. I wanted to ask a question about Joyce and, you know, his writing style. How much of it do you think influenced modern Irish writing today in the world?
Well, that's a good question. Oh my. Well, I think for a while it didn't, in a way. Like it was such a big figure in world literature that people went and did other things. I think of writers in the middle of the century like Frank O'Connor who were influenced and liked Joyce, but really tried to, in terms of the actual writing, they were writing in conventional style in a way that you could read happily and with normal sentences and verbs and everything like that. So some of the kind of experimentalism didn't get into Irish literature in some ways, and maybe apart from people like Samuel Beckett, who was another kind of exile. But I think more recently, I mean, you have Eamon McBride go as a half-form things, which clearly draws on the kind of interior poetry, as Pound says, that Joyce is using, or Mike McCormack's Solar Bones, which again is an almost, I was going to say unpunctuated, but it's not. It has paragraphs and things like that, an almost kind of unpunctuated novel in some ways, that clearly is drawing on the kind of linguistic or syntactical, you know, syntax, the arrangement of a sentence, experimentalism that Joyce is using. So I think it's really kind of come back probably again because people are seeing Joyce in class. You know, it's unfortunate in a way, but most people get Joyce through universities. Sorry, everyone, that's partly our fault. But you know, what it means is that you maybe go to university and you find this book and you think, gosh, I've never really seen much like that before, and that can really inspire people. And I think that's happening now.
The second question I have about language, I assume James Joyce spoke Gaelic or Irish? I think it's Gaelic, right?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, he didn't.
My question really.
Sorry.
He probably did. I mean, he probably didn't or did, but I know he has some ideas about the role of the language in Irish nationalism. But my question really is, how do you think that? Because I remember many people who have asked Soyinka about how difficult his works were. You know, his response have come along the lines of him thinking in a different language forces him to employ metaphors that might seem to the ordinary reader to be difficult, but it's not deliberate, but just a way, an aspiration that, you know, he needs to employ to be able to capture the ideas, the he has in his head. Do you think the idea of Joyce coming from a different language background influenced his language choice in writing English?
I think in a way, yeah, it's interesting. English was his mother tongue. It was probably the experience of certainly of most urban Irish people when he was born in the 1880s. But he was also born into the language revival, where a lot of them were actually trying to learn Irish for the first time. And Joyce did try and learn, and actually was a contemporary of Patrick Pearse, who was one of the great kind of enthusiasts for the Irish language. But Joyce disagrees with him finally, because Patrick Pearse says, "Oh, well, English can't express things properly. Irish is the only language in which you can express things." And Joyce found that wasn't so. I think partly because it's his mother tongue, but he does stand a kind of distance from it. So what you're saying, I think, is right. That I mean, finally, he always thinks of himself in some ways an outsider to the language, even to the literary tradition, which Shakespeare and people are part of. And that's crucial. He's also becomes a language teacher. So he tries to teach English to Italians, which is a very different experience, I think. If you ever tried to teach English to other people, it's a very different experience. You learn your language in a different way. And I think that, plus the fact he was so good at Italian and French and Greek through school and other things, he has lots of languages that he's involved in. So I think that certainly absolutely gives him a kind of, if you like, an insider's view of what English can do, and that has a lot of different. Now, I think we have some questions coming in. Is that right? I've got some on chat.
Yes, we do. We have some on the chat, and I just have one comment that I just want us to think about, and then we're going to go to the questions. We have some on the chat, and we have some in the Q&A. I was interested in your comments, Adrian, when you commented about how by Shoyinka alluding to the classics, it could be seen as elitist. But if we think about the fact that people like Homer and Shakespeare were in fact not elitist at the time that they were writing, and Shakespeare particularly was for everybody and was particularly for the masses, I think it's very interesting how what was initially for the masses is now seen as elitist. And I think that is something we should keep at the back of our heads, that literature should not be in a space that is only for some clever people, but it actually should be a tool to sort of like liberate everybody's mind. Okay, so the first question, I'm going to read out the questions, and please feel free, either of you, to pitch in. So the first question we have is from David. I'm sorry I have to move close, but the text is small. From David to all the panelists, is there any influence of French Enlightenment or thought discernible in both, e.g. the concept of the philosopher, such as Stephen walking along a sandy mount brings Rousseau to mind, as does Shoyinka's reference to toying with concepts in the poem? So let's take that one while I prepared the next question.
Okay, I guess I'll start. That's a great question. A hard question too. I mean, that's, the whole history of philosophy is there. I think Rousseau is important to Joyce for two reasons. One for his kind of almost the kind of naivety of some of his philosophical thinking, really, but also particularly his confessions. Like, I think I forget exactly the line in the beginning of Rousseau's Confessions, but he's promises to present himself, only myself, he says. And he says, I'm unique, I'm not like anyone else, and no one else has ever done this. No one else has revealed as much about themselves as I have. And maybe that kind of candidness, that openness, is something that's perhaps even more influential than Rousseau's kind of political philosophy for someone like Joyce. The possibility of being at once, a kind of great writer and thinker, and also to be able to bear yourself, I was going to say your soul, but you're actually your body, really. And I think Joyce probably takes an awful lot from that as a way of, as a kind of example for thinking about how you might do things and how you might speak to people.
I don't have a comment on this particular. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to?
Can I give you the next one? So, do you think that Joyce and Shoyinka were grappling with the concept of the ideal and of corruption in a subversive way?
It's a good question. I don't know if it's, how subversive is. He was a subversive in his dealings as a young man and his dealings with the Nigerian situation. And as you know, Mr. Akmadela, that all his work that, the stuff that got him in prison in the 60s were related to him deciding that he would, rather not take sides with the Nigerian side or the Biafran side, but to create a third force that he thought would bring both of them to a meeting table. So in some way, yes, I think he was an idealist, and if you read the man, that, I mean, many of the reports about why he was in prison always glossed over exactly why. Many people say, oh, he wrote an article about the Nigerian side and all that, and was arrested. No, he wasn't. He went to the Biafran side. He talked with somebody who was in the military there and tried to get a message from him to another side of the country and try to recruit military people on both sides. He was a very idealistic, very crazy young man trying to do daredevil things for noble causes, of course. So there was an idealism there. So yes, I do agree with you. I don't know what particular other things you were asking for, but his life and his work and his way he's rationalized many of his decisions show that he was certainly, grappling with, the ideal and trying to be subversive in as much as possible.
Let's move on to Anne and Solomon. Do either of you think, or one of you think, that both authors were attempting to explain what people actually felt about life that's within the lines of history? Do you think?
Should I answer
I interpret that.
Go on, sorry.
Question to me. Yes, feel free.
I'll tell you, because I think the next one.
The question from Anne. I think you can read it there.
Yeah, I can read it.
Yes.
You attempted to explain what people actually felt about the life that falls between the lines of history. Well, it's a very eloquent question, actually, first of all. And I mean, the famous line from Ulysses, of course, is Stephen thinking that history is a nightmare from which I'm trying to awake, which he actually borrows, I think, from a 19th century French writer. He kind of steals part of that line. So it's not Joyce's own thought exactly, but I think is something that he wants Stephen to think. And yet he doesn't quite think himself. I mean, history is something you can't quite avoid, and we're all involved in. So I think he's certainly interested in writing about people who would not normally be written about. So one of the reasons Rousseau, for instance, writes about himself in the Confessions, he thinks he's a really great person. And maybe Joyce, for a time, thought that was true too, and that's why he wrote about himself as Stephen Dedalus. But he's also interested in Ulysses, clearly, in people that are maybe not sort of directly written about in history, but have something important to say. And that's the example of that is Leopold and Molly Bloom, I suppose. I mean, but they do affect history. There's a lot of history in the book, so it doesn't it's a difficult one, because history doesn't stay outside the book. There's so much history in the book. Bloom sees the brother of John Stuart Parnell in the streets, who was the kind of great Irish leader. Patriot, yeah, that's it. And he even is supposed to have said something to Arthur Griffith, who's the kind of head of Sinn Féin, about even the idea for Sinn Féin. But he's clearly not also a kind of orthodox Irish nationalist. So Bloom is kind of, I don't know what to say, maybe he's a kind of witness to history rather than a kind of doer, and that may be part of it too. So it's somehow neither outside history nor like as Stephen would wish, nor entirely inside it either. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's a good question.
Okay, and Paula, we're going to ask you to answer Amanda's, and then we're going to go to the Q&A where we have some questions there.
Okay.
So, Paula, do you think there's a role to be played by poetry or prose as being sort of an intellectual consciousness of a nation, which is lacking in Nigeria? And do you think why that is, if indeed it is lacking?
No, I do not think it's lacking. Literature has always been a part of us, and it will continue to be. I think what I see when I look at the field, I kind of look at it differently. There's English literature, of course, literature written in English, but there's also literature of what we call orature, which has always been a part of us. oral transmission of poetry from Ijala to Ewi to Dakwada and all this traditional Yoruba poetry, and there is Igbo and Hausa and all of that. So all of those traditions still exist as a conscience of society, and that will remain to be so. Literature, poetry, written prose in English, in different languages, are important in modern conversations about who we are, who we think we want to be, and all of that. And Chirinka's work has certainly played a role there. So has Achebe, so has Adichie, so has Okigbo, and everyone else. And it will continue to be. Again, there are still contemporary writers writing today, and they will continue to be. I think the problem with Chirinka's work in the 60s and stuff was that people who were new to reading African writers were not expecting a literature that kind of, was, seemed alien because it wasn't simple Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and it made them think, and it made them, and the writer was taking them to, the advanced length. I mean, he was lucky to have had this Western education, and it was already ahead of this and the environment, and it was writing for people who just had, Nigerian education and were not exposed to as much of those dimensions as he thought. But his work didn't make his work less relevant to the environment, is what I'm trying to say. That even the so-called obscurantism or the elusiveness of the meaning of his work doesn't make it less relevant as a means of, either critiquing society, understanding society, or expressing personal opinion or ambition about the place. So I think work will continue to be written. Some of them will continue to be relevant immediately, and some will continue to be relevant, as people figure out, what the author was trying to do and trying to say. But I think maybe the problem is that we always look usually towards literature written in English as the only expression of literature, especially in Nigeria, and that blinds us to a number of work that still exists that continue to challenge our expectations and our understanding of ourselves and our role and our ambition to what we need to be. I hope that answers.
And especially in the North, where there's so much literature being written in Hausa, which we are not really doing as much of in Yoruba and people here.
Yeah.
In the North, they have a very huge Hausa language publishing industry, which unfortunately Yoruba and Igbo language and other minority languages are not yet at that level. And I think that's a very important development that we need to think about, because if as a people we are not preserving our language and we're not speaking it, we're not passing it down, we have to have it in mind that it's going to eventually evaporate, and we have to have that in mind and think about how do we preserve it and encourage literacy in those languages. Okay, I'm going to go to the two questions on the Q&A. This is for Kola. It's interesting to see how Irish writers have influenced the Nigerian writers who emerged in the late 1950s. And I wonder if you think, I wonder what you think Nigerian writers on in English.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't know whether we want to have a specific canon in the syllabus for Irish influenced Nigerian writers or English influenced Nigerian writers. I think that's a whole. I mean, we're still struggling with even the idea of literature in English being the only literature we study in schools. And I'm very passionate about changing that description in the first place, because we go through school and then you have a subject called literature in English, and all you do is reading literature in English. Of course, sometimes from the UK and Western world, and then there's Nigerian literature in English. But there are several literatures that are not in English, like Aduni mentioned, and there are many other literatures that are indigenous to Nigeria as well. Some of them still in the oral form and some not. So I've always believed that even the literary syllabus is already too limited, and always talking about only literatures in English. And I think we should widen it a little bit. So maybe if we do widen it and we expand it enough to allow at least students to experience the different types of creative work that have been made, then we can look at the English subsection and then decide that, well, there are other non English influenced writers as well. I mean, but I assume that people who are studying this, people already know. If you read any review of Shoyinka's work from the 60s, you will find people who mention the influence of Joyce on his work. And I'm sure there are other Irish influenced writers currently writing or have written in the past. Scholars do all this work all the time. So I don't think it's a hidden secret. It's just nice to have a forum like this to discuss and share what we've discovered about them.
So this is the last question because we're almost running out of time. But I think this is a very germane question because it actually touches on something that we are all undergoing now. So I'm just going to read it out. How can, if at all, and this is the question from BC, how can, if at all possible, solitude help the various players in the creative sector, from architecture to couture and everything in between? The period of lockdown has caused immense disruption in these areas. How can it be made a positive experience? I think that this is a very important question because something that we had intended to touch and we haven't actually had time to touch it. All of us, in a way, in all over the world in the last 2 months, have all been isolated. We've all felt at least, even obviously, perhaps not all of us extremely in jail, but we've all had that feeling of being compulsorily kept in your house. How has that feeling of isolation connected all of us? And to answer this question, how has it, do we think it has had a positive influence on on creativity as a whole, or has it been stifling? Both of you, and then we're going to round up.
That's a wonderful question, and I guess the one we're all trying to answer, right? This is partly why we're here, to try and make something positive from a situation which for many people is not positive and doesn't seem likely, and including the creative sector, of course. I have lots of friends who are musicians who are really struggling. I think music, more than almost anything, is something you can't really do isolated. I started with the idea that song connects people. Well, it's very hard for musicians to play together right now, and even online, all those videos you see are kind of recorded very carefully and joined up. They're not really playing together. It's possible that when we all get back together, even things like orchestras will not be able to perform because there'll be no audiences, and so many of them may struggle. I guess my best answer is to come back to the things we've been talking about, is that art can do something important and can take us to other people even when we're alone. And maybe that means just finding a space to read, or maybe it means learning a poem or doing something you wouldn't otherwise have done. I've certainly done a lot of things in the last few months that I wouldn't have expected to do. And I think maybe some of the Soyinka and Joyce and others can tell us about the idea that art can change us, and that even if we may be sort of apart from other people at the time, art is the thing that can connect us. And particularly poems and particularly novels can really join us to other people. I mean, it's a kind of empathetic ideal. It's a 19th century ideal, I suppose, that the written words can bind us to other people. And so maybe we come back from this with different perspectives. I hope so, in a way, and that can be the kind of new thing that artists can build on. I know some artists have found it very productive period, and I know some have found it impossible to do the work that they were doing before. And I hope that what it has done for me anyway is to remind me of the importance of art and culture. I probably have never before in my life been so reliant on art and culture to get me through the day, and I think that is really, for myself, has helped enormously. And if we can at all have access to it afterwards, that will be something I will take with me.
Fantastic. What are your views?
I agree with Adrian mostly. Solitude is a chance to connect, at least for me, with my mind and the things that don't need other people to do, like reading, like writing, like learning to play the guitar, something I did over the last couple of weeks. The guitar I had never played, beyond a few seconds in class, but I got one before the lockdown, and it gave me time to practice and spend time with it, and spend time more in my own head. as much as I would have with other people if the lockdown hadn't happened. So I assume that people for whom being alone is an important part of their work, people who need to think more than they need to speak, this would be a good time, their books to read and all that. I believe Professor Inka himself is in isolation somewhere. And writers, particularly those whose work have been disrupted by, who would have otherwise had to like add teaching to their work, for instance, spend time in classes and grading and all that, now have all this free time to, if they still don't do classes online, that is, write and read and do other things. So I assume that it gives, for some people it's a good thing. Hopefully, or maybe in the next couple of years, we will find more points like Ulysses, somebody writing in isolation and lockdown, maybe in a hospital, what's it called, quarantine. I don't know how this poem would be different anyway if it was written by someone in quarantine. It's about the same thing, being in one place and contemplating your life and trying to connect it to the world and other people who have come before. So to me, I'm just excited about the possibilities that exist. There are people who have been adversely affected, of course, and we hope that they also find a way to make it work for them.
To say a word for teachers, a lot of teachers I know have been doing classes anyway online, but I'm not so much a cultural producer, but I know you, Kola, you're curating an anthology of poems. This is in some ways clearly has kind of helped you bring people together, voices you don't know. That's interesting.
That is true. Yes, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, it's a way of me connecting, because I started this by, during the process while I was in self-quarantine, as soon as I got in. And it was my way of trying to connect with other people who I assume were also writing at the moment. And I just wanted to read what they were writing, just send me your poems that you're reading during the quarantine, me assuming that everybody had at least started writing something. It turned out that not everybody was, but there were people who, just because I said it, started thinking, well, I could actually write about, what I'm feeling. And just having a record of that moment and that space, for me as a writer, is something very interesting. We'll look back on this moment and we may not remember just everything that happened, but a record of the mental state you were in and how you felt about it, and how, in poetry or in prose or in whatever, might be a good thing to refer to and to talk about in a couple of years from now.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
So I'd like to first of all thank the panelists, Paula and Adrian, for your erudite contributions. I'd like to thank all the attendees who have spent time with us, and I'd like to thank the Embassy of Ireland in Nigeria for organizing and putting this together. If you've been inspired attendees, please remember Ronan's video at the beginning. There is a poetry competition, 40 lines on the theme of isolation. Please send in your contributions. I think it's to the Twitter account, isn't it? And but if you go on the Embassy of Ireland of Nigeria Twitter account, he will post the details there. You have 40 days, and here you are. So the submissions are to Abuja Embassy at dfa.ie with the subject line Bloomsday competition. We'd love you to come in and submit, and thank you very much for all of your time. Thank you.
Thank you for having us. Thank you for your wonderful moderation, Ms. Gomez. You've been wonderful.
Oh,
and thank
it was
you,
a
Adrian.
pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you,
so much.
Adrian.
Thank you, Aduke. That was wonderful.
Yes, it would be nice to have
Adrian and Kola, don't go yet. And Kola, let's take a photograph of all of us. I'm sure you can do that.
Okay.
Let me see. Let me see how we can do that. It's
see if you can
strange.
Do it. Okay. You first of all have to stop the sharing.
Okay. Oh, I see. That's probably why. Okay.
Okay.
Screenshot.
So, yeah, screenshot.
Hold on. Let me do another one.
Okay. Okay, and then, you know what you can do? There's a way. Can you put the original flyer up, and then we'll be on the side. Then we can take that as well. You know what I mean? Hello, are you frozen?
Can you hear me? You guys are frozen.
Yes.
I look like photograph.
Okay, no, you're not. Okay, can you put up the original flyer, and then the three of us will be at the side.
That's a good idea. I can do that if you want.
Okay, yeah. So there's a way, if you put up the original flyer, then I think there's a way that the three of us can stay. Then you can take a screenshot of that. Because it's always good to have a record of these things.
Do you want me to try it? Should I try it? If I share screen, it would work.
Yeah.
All right. So I took the photo. I think something happened to my internet and I disappeared.
No.
Oh, okay.
No. I want the photo with the thing up, and then the three of us to be on top.
Oh, right.
Then
Okay.
Then there should be a way. Then there should be a way at the same time that we can be seen, isn't there?
I can see you and I can see the thing, but we're not at the top. We're at the side.
Okay. You can see the three of us.
Yes, but we're at the side, not at the top.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I can't see anybody, so please take it.
Okay, let me do that. Give me a second here. Program selfie. Okay, got it. Let me do one more.
Fantastic.
All right. Thank you, Ronan. Thank you very much. He left a comment in the thing. He said he's on the way to the airport.
Oh, okay, yes, okay. Yeah, you see, I can. Okay, there you are. I can see you on top now. Okay, take it again.
I'm smiling, so I don't know if.
Yes.
Don't know if
Kola, take it. We're smiling. Okay.
I'm smiling happily.
Okay, Kola, take it again.
Now?
No,
Okay.
take it again. Take it again.
Oh, is Ronan here? My internet is slow. Hold on a second. It's not.
I'm just looking at the screen. You guys carry on.
Yes. Okay, no.
I'm trying to look as nice as possible.
All right.
Okay, take it now, please.
Do you think he has? He probably has. Shall I stop the sharing?
Hang on, I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, okay. He seems to have gone. Okay. Adrian, it was a pleasure. We shall talk again.
I can't see you guys.
Oh, he's back. He's
I
back.
can only see
Okay,
myself.
yes. No.
We can hear you, though. We can hear you.
we can hear you. We can hear you. Thank goodness this happened at the end.
Oh, yeah, true. Good point. But it's we can hear you, Carla, or at least sometimes we can hear you.
I'm here now.
You're back. You're back.
I'm back. I
Yeah,
can't see.
okay.
Okay, so what do you want me to do?
Okay.
Oh no.
But if you
Say it again. What do you want me to do?
our own faces as well. Have that.
Oh, he wanted a shot. Well, sorry, Adike wanted a shot with the screen, with the flyer, and then all our faces. Did you take one of those?
I think I did. I think so.
Yes.
Let me take another one. Let me take another one with just three of us on the screen.
Okay.
Yeah.
We were all busy smiling. We were trying to look as happy as we could.
Pretend to talk. Pretend to have conversation.
Pretend to talk. Oh. Well,
yes,
I'm laughing.
I think
Yeah.
I've taken those. By the way, what do you do on Bloomsday? What do you do?
Oh, I should have said. Yeah.
What is
Well,
celebration? What do we do?
you can do lots of things. I mean, if you were in Dublin right now, we'd be walking around the city. You might be dressing up in clothes. You could probably go to the pub, which is where they go. They go and have quite a lot of drinks. Bloom has a glass of wine and gorgonzola cheese, I think, at about lunchtime, about just before 2 o'clock. So
Okay.
in theory, you can do that kind of thing, and then in the evening you can kind of mill about the streets, and they go to the kind of I guess kind of the night town area of Dublin, which is you know, they don't actually visit prostitutes, but they go really near that. So obviously, I'm not suggesting that part, but but you could, yeah. There's lots of things you can do. You can buy soap. You can. I think the best thing is to kind of, you know, I don't know. There's actually quite a few other events that you could listen to, or there's
Have you
there's a
decided on how you're going to
broadcast.
spend?
Well, some of it I might. They're doing a whole. I'll send you the link. Maybe there's an RT broadcast of the whole thing, the kind of dramatic reading of it, that I think they have on their website. So you could, if you wanted, you could do bits of that. I know that there's some event at 4 o'clock that I'm not speaking at, but I want to hear. It's odd doing it alone. Usually it's a convivial thing, like you do it with friends. So
Okay.
it's a strange feeling. But I think we should certainly have a toast of
Okay.
Nice.
of red wine if you have that, and if not, Stephen drinks pints and whiskey and anything. So anything would do, really.
Nice.
Okay.
What
Fantastic.
are your plans?
Well, what am I going to do? Or Duque, what are you going to do?
Okay, what am I going to? Oh gosh, I think actually I'm just going to be relieved. I think it actually went well. Thank you very much to the two of you. I was really nervous. I mean, but I think from the comments. Okay, yes, okay. Okay, they've now told us that we should stop recording.
Oh yeah, good point.
Okay.
Yeah, we've got all that on camera.
Yes. Okay. Okay, so let's stop. But
Top left is the sign that says recording. I don't know if I can stop it
Okay.
though. Can I stop it?
Caller, can you stop the recording? Okay. We have 8 participants left. Most of the rest of them have gone.
I thought we'd stop broadcasting, but maybe we haven't. It doesn't matter.
No. I don't know where the stop broadcasting thing is. Hang on. Stop recording. Okay. If I press the stop recording.
Try that.
Caller. Okay, let me just press. But he was the one who was recording, so
I stopped
Okay.
the recording now. Well, I still...
okay, you've stopped it? Okay.
Yes.